I would like to just welcome our panel. For the sake of time, I think we'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves when we start to talk about some of the questions that we have. The topic for this title is very relevant to the theme of the Social Innovation Summit. Effective partnerships for good should probably be added to that. How can we do a better job? How can we move the needle? And what I'd like to do is have our panelists start off, who are experts in this area, by introducing themselves briefly, their organizations, and address the first question, which is on the sort of challenge side of this, if you will. What have you seen over the last number of years in the work that each of you are doing that has inhibited or has been a blockage or in some way been a challenge to effective partnership? We'll start with that, and then we'll go to the positive in the next half of the time. So, Ricardo, introduce yourself, please, and answer the question. Thank you. It's probably on.
Is this working? Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill, Professor Walcott, for the invitation to join. My name is Ricardo Michel. I'm a Deputy Director at United States Agency for International Development in the Office of Innovation and Development Alliances. Our mission and idea, as we're called, is really to enhance the agency's ability to address long-standing development issues by using innovation being new processes as well as technology, but also introducing new partners and diverse mindsets into the solutions. So through that, one of the divisions I oversee is our global partnerships. We've been engaged in partnerships for over a decade at USAID. We facilitated over 1,000 partnerships, leveraged over $14 billion, and we've probably interacted with over 3,000 partners in an attempt to advance our development issues. As far as challenges, there are a litany of challenges that we run into. I think first and foremost, when you're dealing with any multi-stakeholder environments or engagements, that in and of itself presents a challenge. And as was alluded to earlier by Professor Walcott, not much of it is rocket science, but we found that being open, being very honest in terms of the initial engagement, the expectations that one wants out of this partnership is critical to the success. The opportunities that we see around this frank and open discussion is that as we look to partner more to leverage the development impact, that there's actually an increasing overlap between our development needs and core business interests for the public sector. So that actually allows a lot of room for us to think creatively. Secondly, it's actually to be very honest about the core capabilities that you each bring into the partnership. This will really allow us to focus on not just the impact, but really the methodology. And I would say thirdly, it's really putting in place a sound governing structure, starting obviously with an MOU, but thinking through all of those contingencies and planning. So I'll stop there and allow the other speakers to expand.
Great. And let's continue that theme of being very practical about, and as everyone in the room is involved, or virtually everyone in some form of partnership, what are the practical things that sort of inhibit or challenge effective partnerships?
So thank you, and I'm honored to be here. My name is Kathy Casserly. I'm the CEO of Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a nonprofit, global nonprofit here in Mountain View with the headquarters here, and we promote innovation, creativity, and sharing on the internet through legal and technical tools. And we work in many domains, including education, science, government, as well as foundations as we move ahead. My work, just to give a little bit of background, I think the context is this incredible partnerships that we work in with Creative Commons. So we have 100 affiliates in 70 jurisdictions around the world, so we very much a networked effect. And so when we think about that, and we think about the many, many MOUs and partnerships we have, and thinking about what it takes to succeed. Another piece of this, just to throw in, and from my practical framing and my experience, is prior to this position, I was a program director at the Hewlett Foundation, where I spearheaded the work in the intersection of education and technology, which led to the Open Educational Resources movement. And this relies on Creative Commons licensing, which allows for the sharing. But part of that story is part of my role as a funder there, is to think about how you actually build partnerships and how you put together a vision with the collective community, whatever that size of partnership looks like, but that there be a willingness for whatever that vision is to change. So in 2001, when we created a vision, we had a pretty clear idea of what we wanted to get to. So I think that vision endures, and so sometimes the mission and vision endures, but the tactical strategies to get there can change. And when you go into a partnership, I think one of the critical elements is trust. That you know these partners well enough that you develop the trust with the community, because there are going to be a lot of bumps in that road. And that road, you're going to hit walls, and there's going to be failure. And the important thing isn't that that there might be failure, because I think any of us in any difficult task we've undertaken, there is failure. We hit the wrong road. The important thing is that you actually have to be able to come back, and you have to be able to pivot pretty quickly and say, okay, that didn't work. But let's not spend our time blaming each other or pointing the finger or saying where we should have spent our resources differently. Let's take from this point in time now what we've learned and how the ecosystem has changed and figure out what the next path is ahead. And I'd say that's my probably most important piece of context. I think I've applied it very much in the work that we did then. You have to be ready for failure. And failure is not a word people are comfortable with. And it's not one that we often admit to. And it's very hard sometimes, particularly in the social space, to identify what the metrics are for making social change as opposed to technical change. So these are all kind of some of the barriers that you have in a partnership. So I think in the early days, it takes a little bit of time to develop the trust. And once you have the trust, then you can go forward and you can hit the roads and you can build the path. But I think that's really critically important. Sometimes we jump into partnerships a little bit too quickly without knowing each other well enough and understanding where we're trying to go. And if we don't have that clarity, I think then it creates different problems down the line which create more time constraints. So while we're all anxious to solve the problems yesterday, we have to spend a little bit of time community building to make it really happen.
I want to stay on that theme after we have our friend Deepak talk a little bit about some of the challenges you've seen in your years at HP and elsewhere.
Sure. So good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. My name is Deepak Michel. I've been in the technology industry for over 20 years now. And HP is where I'm at today, but there are many other companies I've been with and in Silicon Valley. And you're probably familiar with a lot of the products that we build, and certainly I spent a lot of my early years developing those products. But really in the last, say, 15 years, I've spent much more time on the application of these technologies, working with customers, both public and private, trying to understand how to take this new technology and apply it to a problem, whether it's a business problem or a social problem. And I find that just so much more fascinating than actually building these tools. And in fact, that's what they are. They're only tools. They only get used when you try to solve something. And that's where partnership comes in. As a vendor, as a seller of this technology, as a consultant of this technology, we have to partner with customers to understand how best to use them. And that's where my partnership comes in. And I think I've had quite a few successes and many failures in terms of building these partnerships with my customer. And what I found works best and what hasn't worked in the past is if you don't have a common goal, and I think you alluded to this as well, both sides really have to have a common goal, a common objective, a common vision of what that end result needs to be. Without that, you're wasting time. In a sense, you're trying to move in different directions, and at the end of the day, whether it's months or years later, you haven't fundamentally altered anything. So without that vision, without that objective, you don't make a lot of progress.
The overall sort of objective is one thing I've heard clearly. You've got to have, through the fog, the lighthouse out there that you're going towards. It might not be, and certainly these days in difficult economic and changing times with discontinuous change, particularly in the space, the tech space that many in this room are in, you can't predict a lot into the future, right? It's unpredictable. But you have a vision of where you want to go. That's key. But then coming back to the point that I think all three of you talked about, this basic fundamental element of trust. And I would add relationships based on trust. And then I think the third level up is collaboration. And then perhaps partnering In other words, collaborating for a purpose to get something done. So let's go all the way back to the building blocks, because as in any relationship, perhaps, I would suggest to you that if you don't start with that basic element of trust, you can't get to the next. There is a little bit of sequential building here, correct? So in your experience, what has helped to cultivate trust in business context here, whether it's in a nonprofit, a social enterprise, a corporate, whatever, in that kind of a context? What is it that you see as really the essence of that, and how would you can't manage that. That's the long pole. That's the difficult part. But how do you help create an environment for that?
Good question, really. And one of the benefits I've had in my role is to be able to travel around the world and see how other cultures handle these types of situations. And I think, especially in this country and especially in the Western world, we take a lot of these points for granted. We try to rush to that final conclusion, the result, as opposed to spending the time, building the trust early on. And I think that's one of the best differentiators about how to succeed here. To take advantage of that time up front when you meet someone new or start to build a partnership, to build that trust and enhance that relationship, maybe outside the scope of the project or whatever you may be working on. And that takes time, and that lends itself to building on the next step where you can start to begin collaboration. I think other cultures do that pretty well, and I think we can learn something from it.
Let me go to Ricardo, who has the challenge of working with the government, and we all smile, right? We smiled before. We both come from similar backgrounds, so we can do that before we're doing what we're doing today. But, obviously the USAID, the government is often the big so-called 800-pound gorilla in the room. How does that work? How do you build on the level of trust that we're saying is really the key secret X factor here? How do you do that?
He's controlling it, okay. Well, I think it's easy for me, Bill. I walk in the room, I say, I'm from the U.S. government, I'm here to help. You need to just trust me when I say that.
That usually does help a lot. We like that.
Well, it really starts for us with sharing common values. Again, it's speaking to the objectives. Obviously, trust works two ways. As a large entity, we are implicitly trusted. We have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayer to deploy the resources that we're entrusted with judiciously to achieve a development impact. But in that, we need to trust you that you can deliver as our partners when we're trying to advance those development initiatives. Again, it goes down to cultivating the relationships, as my colleague spoke about, and we see that done in a lot of different places. Cultivating the relationships for us really starts at the beginning of the concept. I would say engage us early and often, but also be patient. It is a larger bureaucracy. We will help you navigate, and we have mechanisms that we can help explore and push, but realize that it's very hard for us to just pick one winner. And we need to really get comfortable that the limited resources we have and the number of opportunities we have to deploy them, that we are partnering with those who can actually deliver. Trust also for us institutionally is not in the hands of one person. So we are a very large and decentralized organization. Cultivating relationships means not just coming to Washington, but to the extent you have tentacles and a footprint in those countries where you want to be where you want to have impact, you cultivate the relationships there as well. And again, that goes back to sharing common values. Our missions really understand the geographies in which they operate, they understand the needs on the ground, and to the extent your solutions are addressing those needs, it's easier for us to really be able to partner with you moving on those.
But as we all know, and to build on that, this is a lot easier said than done. It's easy to talk about, but hard to do. You've seen it from a number of different angles in your career, and you bring a practical expertise in diagnosing where there isn't trust, right? And then building openness. I know that's a life theme of yours. So perhaps you can speak to that. Like, how do you overcrack that code, particularly if you have people or organizations representing, it's the individuals and it's the organizations, right? And, that you have to deal with, right? Because they have their briefs and they've got their reasons for operating commercially or otherwise, right? As well as in the nonprofit world, right? Sharp elbows, going to the donors, coming into Ricardo's office, right? Meeting one another in the hallway and yet wanting to cooperate at the same time. How do you get through that, practically speaking, in the real world?
So I would say I've used some concrete examples. So in the open world, we do work with the proprietary, nonprofit and proprietary. And we've always, in the work, we always kept the door open. So the door was always open for anyone, whatever side of the aisle, because it's about choice, the work of openness that we do in the collaborative work. And while some may, and I often say that depending on who I sit next to, I look incredibly liberal or extremely conservative, depending on who it is that day. So there's a whole range of people who use the space of which we work in, and we encourage that, and what we do is try to find the fit for that individual and that consumer in that way, and the choice. On some practical steps, I think when you enter partnerships, it's really important not to bite off too much at once. So to begin, a good way to build trust is to take a first step. And I think really defining the boundary of what that first step is really important. So I think I did this both in my funding role, and I also do it now as a leader in the organization. While we're working in many different projects in different ways, what do we need to do right now? So take apart the larger vision and say, what can we do as a first step to begin to build that bridge? And then let's evaluate where we are and we move to the next phase. So it gives you some boundaries for success, because all partners want to be successful early on. It gives you a chance to really understand what skills are being brought to the table. It raises clarity if there are some assumptions that were unspoken that hadn't been addressed. You can begin to then readdress them. So I think that's one way as you think about the road ahead. And then I think particularly in the work that I'm involved in openness and transparency and accountability and collaboration, it's what we live and breathe. So it's part of the values of what each person who comes to the table brings. And no matter what type of organization they sit in, this is kind of connectiveness that we have across cultures, across the whole globe, which transcends the local customs and barriers. And we also, in some ways, empower, certainly the role that we do with our global affiliates, is the people in the local regions are the experts, and we put them out front because they are the trusted partner who understands the problems on the ground in a way that folks here sitting in Mountain View could never do appropriately.
And I love the sort of balance you have between, the average layperson hears open, they think sort of metaphysics, right? Way out there, right? Somewhere out in the sky. I had my yoga class last night, putting my hand here, right? But then you think, well, practically speaking, what is it that's it's gonna take? And what's gonna really be difficult about this? And it's very much like your partner or your spouse or a child or whatever it is in your family, the getting the credibility, getting those small moments where you're succeeding together and you're getting traction is really crucial, isn't it? That's the psychic as well as the social benefit. But then I'd go up to the higher level, and I'll ask you the hard question of our friend from a corporate environment. How do you ring the cash register then? How do you look at the outcome and the impact and the benefits side? How do you ring, and it may be the social benefit cash register, okay, I'll give that, and sometimes it's the real cash register. You have to show to the sales and marketing team that you're ultimately going to sell HP PCs or put software on them or whatever it might be, right? So how do you balance that and actually ring the cash register so the old doing well and doing good at the same time?
Yeah, it is a very much of a balance, and in my world, everything is pretty much dollars and cents. Every activity, every sale, every consulting project has a dollar or a profit tag associated with it, and that's the way we measure in the corporate world. I think what we need to do is a better job of is finding those other benefits that are not necessarily related to a monetary gain, and those can be based on building a relationship for longer term. Either providing some kind of an effort or a project that might gain some benefits in the future, and we actually do that. In the corporate world, we do that quite a bit. I think Microsoft, was talked about earlier today about how they also give back. One of the things that we like to do with our customers is we will provide a lot of sample technology just to get associated with it, where there's not an immediate return, but it builds trust in that relationship that you can build upon and then take that to the next level. And maybe down the line there might be something that would ring the cash register.
We only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to just have you talk a little bit about sort of tangible examples. We learn from people talking to us, teaching, I'd say. We learn a lot from experience, and we learn a lot from models, right? From seeing. And, okay, I can learn from that. I may not copy it, but I can learn transferable things from it, right? So can you render a little bit as we go through back down the line again, one example of what you would say is an effective partnership that you've seen firsthand that moved the needle, and you got to do it in about a minute each. Sure. So quickly, we only have a few minutes to go. Thank you.
Sure. I think one good example when we start thinking about partnering, we're looking a lot to our private sector partners, really to ensure sustainability and the long-term viability of our development initiatives. And through our dialogues, we've seen, again, that intersection where this speaks to their core business. We've seen a lot of people going to countries very much consumer-facing. They're worried about workforce. Where can I get the skilled labor, whether it be on the distribution or the manufacturing side? That actually dovetails nicely with a lot of the efforts that we are pursuing for broadly education. So we're able to work very closely with companies to help support some of our education needs, which ultimately feed into a more educated, skilled workforce that actually benefits them in the long term in that country. So quick examples.
Kathy?
So I'll talk about the Department of Labor 2 years ago released $2 billion under President Obama for job training to the community colleges. And what they did in their solicitation grant agreement is required that the outputs of the grants carry a Creative Commons license. So we became partners in this government program that made sure that the public had access to what the public produces with their taxpayer goods. And what's important about that is that there's an opportunity to build and extend. It isn't a one-time investment. It's something that can continue to grow. And I would say that partnership is something that kind of took a long time to develop, in that there were many supporters and champions for us who understood what Creative Commons license were. We weren't involved in that partnership directly when that happened, but we became, and the goal and vision of Creative Commons became realized by part of that. So that was where many of the early relationships came to fruition. And that when we also had then the opportunity to provide technical assistance, we now have this ability through this network of community colleges across the country who are now developing products, who are learning about the positive benefits and the network effects of openness. So it's becoming a very tangible kind of project per se that has huge multiplier effects.
You kind of had a right to be heard almost.
We had built to that point.
You'd built to the point where you had a right, you had an authenticity and a credibility that gave you the right to be heard.
So one of the difficulties that I deal with selling technology and applying technology is the psychology of change. As many of you know, anytime you have to adopt a new technology, you have to change. And the older we get, the harder it is to make that change. But one of the things that we did successfully in partnering with a customer is to take, with my peer, an understanding of what that change would require amongst the population who's adopting this new technology, and really focus on the psychology of that change as opposed to just the technology and all the bits and bytes of what's going on, and to help them understand what it takes in terms of people to make that change. And that's a big part of what we do as well.
Well, we're just about done. I'd like to leave you with a couple thoughts as we sort of summarize what we've heard today. I think we've heard that it starts at a very much the trust level, and you have to work through that basic ability to trust another person, not just an institution, but you have to be able to trust that person. And then I think you build a relationship over time. And then from there you start to do things together. You share, you open the kimono a little bit. It moves from just sort of talking, and isn't this a great vision, like we said, but it's also something that we can kind of, I'll share with you and let you know a little bit more about me. You disclose a little bit, become more open. And then I think you evolve to where, if it's effective through those stages, you evolve to where you actually say, let's do something together. Now, so often groups, as we pointed out, want to jump there, but they realize they create some formality, but there's no organism. It's all structure. It's all a facade, really. It's all on paper. It may be well-funded even, but it's still on paper. Or it might not be well-funded, but it's still something that's not real. So I think it's best to have the organism before you have the organization. Have that organic characteristic to the relationships as much as possible, and then grow out of that, and then do out of the being, in a sense. I'm very fortunate in that I'm now the Chief Executive Officer at NetHope. And we have folks like Frank Scott and others in the room, Frank formerly of Microsoft, who've seen NetHope grow over the years. I'm an honest broker. It was created before I joined it. It was founded by 7 NGOs originally with one pain point. They had a common pain point. There was like one beggar telling another beggar where to go find the food. And they all had a common need, in this case, in rural access, in the most difficult parts of Africa in certain locales. And they didn't have a name for it. It just, in fact, it was Cisco, who I assume is in the room, John Morgridge and John Chambers and others, kind of invited them to sort of start to talk to one another. And it was Save the Children and World Vision and Oxfam and CARE and these various groups, Mercy Corps, that for the first time were sort of saying, we have the same needs. But really the key, as I read of the history, I'm 6 years in, it's 11 years old, is that they started to meet in living rooms of one another. They just started to have meals together. They didn't have a name yet. It was ad hoc. And then that grew, as I say, into saying, okay, let's share with one another. Now let's do a project together. And now it's grown to where 37 international NGOs collaborate from in 180-some countries around the world, 40-some corporates, U.S., USAID, various government agencies, corporates, and others work together for the common vision based on trust, based on relationships. And let's face it, that's what life is all about. So thank you very much for the time.
Right.